The whole town froze when the stranger rode in. Black horse, rifle on his back, and eyes that looked like they'd already buried a dozen men and didn't mind making it a dozen more. He stopped in front of the abandoned church, pointed straight at the woman they'd cast out, and said loud enough for every soul in Carson Hollow to hear, "She's my wife. And that baby? Mine too." Gasps cut through the silence like blades, and the sheriff's hand twitched toward his holster. But no one moved. But what happened next will shock even those who thought they'd seen everything. But first, let's go back to the beginning. They said Carson Hollow was a town where God turned his back, but I never expected they'd turn theirs on me first. The coach wheezed to a halt like it had been running from something it didn't quite escape. Dust clung to the windows like old sins, and when the door creaked open, the air hit me dry and judgmental. I stepped down with a careful hand on my belly, swollen just enough to betray me in the wrong kind of light. The driver didn't offer to help. He didn't even look at me. Just tossed my bag to the dirt and muttered something about girls like me. The platform was crooked, the wood worn gray with age and gossip. Eyes crawled out of every doorway, every corner of the street. Men in stained hats, women in dresses 2 years out of fashion, a preacher with a mouth that twitched like he wanted to spit. They didn't know my name, but they knew I wasn't from here, and that was enough. In a town this small, the arrival of anything unfamiliar spreads like disease. I stood there, stiff as the cross on the church steeple, trying to summon the image of Joseph Tucker, the man I was supposed to marry. He'd written like a gentleman, said he had a ranch, 3 horses, and no children. Said he was looking for a good-hearted woman to share his life with. Said he didn't mind the past as long as she was honest. Well, I'd been honest, mostly. But Joseph wasn't there. Not at the platform, not near the mercantile, not waiting with flowers or a smile. Just me and my secret and the whole damn town breathing down my neck. My boots sank slightly in the dirt, the kind that clings like it wants to keep you. Somewhere behind me, a boy snorted laughter. A woman whispered something into her friend's ear, and the friend made a sound like she'd swallowed vinegar. By sundown, the whole town had gathered like flies around rot. Shadows stretched long across the street, the kind that made good men look like ghosts, and Joseph Tucker stood center stage in front of the saloon, acting like a prophet with a bottle in one hand and a holier-than-thou grin carved across his face. "She's carrying another man's bastard," he barked, the words cracking through the air like a whip. "You think I'll raise it as mine?" And just like that, my fate was sealed. Laughter erupted. Not the kind that comes from something funny, but the cruel, communal kind that's meant to bury someone alive. I felt it crawl over my skin, 1,000 judgmental fingers pricking at every inch of me. The barkeep chuckled behind his barrel chest. A ranch hand whistled low and slow like I was some show they hadn't paid for. Even the sheriff, that dead-eyed buzzard, leaned against the post and smiled around a toothpick like he'd seen this play before and liked how it ended. But I didn't cry. I wouldn't give them that. My face stayed stone, my hands clenched white at my sides, nails biting into palm. Inside, something cracked, quietly, like the first hairline fracture in glass before the whole thing shatters. Joseph had promised me a new life in ink, letter after letter, sweet with words about fresh starts and God's grace. But now, standing there with his boots planted wide and self-righteous venom on his tongue, he looked at me like I was a plague he hadn't seen coming. "They always lie," he said, voice rising. "They always come looking for a fool to clean up their mess." I wanted to scream, not to deny it, but to tell the truth, the real kind. About William, the man who left me. About the nights I'd spent praying not to lose the baby or my mind. About the desperation that led me to answer Joseph's ad with shaking hands and borrowed hope. But none of that mattered here. In Carson Hollow, justice didn't come from truth. It came from who shouted first, and Joseph was the loudest man in the room. The sun dipped lower, setting the sky on fire while they burned me with their eyes. And in that moment, I understood something ugly and simple. I wasn't a person to them. I was a problem. One they didn't want solved. Just gone. The church squatted on the edge of town like a memory no one wanted to remember. Its white paint peeled into ribbons, windows smeared with dust and bird shit. The steeple cracked where lightning must have struck years ago. It leaned slightly east, like it was tired of standing. But to me, it was sanctuary. I slept on the floorboards beneath a rotting cross, wrapped in my coat and shame. Each night was a slow, freezing death in pieces. First the fingers, then the toes, then the parts of your soul you thought were unbreakable. The pews groaned with age when the wind blew, and sometimes I could almost pretend they were voices. Not kind ones, not holy, just whispers of judgment with nowhere else to go. There was no food, no fire, just silence, and the throb of my unborn child's presence echoing in the cavity of my body like a promise I was trying hard not to break. I'd press both hands against my stomach at night, holding on like I could protect us from more than cold and hunger, like I could hold back the world itself. Miss Ada came only after the second night. Widow of the town's last preacher, she looked like she'd been born with grief stitched into her skin. Hair pinned into a bun so tight it pulled her face taut, eyes gray and soft around the edges but sharp in the center. She didn't knock, just opened the broken door and stood with a wrapped bundle in one hand and a revolver tucked in her belt like a warning to anyone who followed her. "They hate what they don't understand," she said, setting the bread down beside me. "But hate doesn't pay the price it demands. You will." She didn't mean it cruel, just honest, like someone who's buried too many people to bother lying anymore. The bread was hard and dry, but it tasted like mercy. I thanked her with my eyes because words felt too fragile, too small for the weight of that gesture. She nodded and left, the cold rushing in as the door swung behind her, reminding me how temporary kindness can be. It was the fourth morning when I saw the blood. A rust-colored stain in the straw I'd laid beneath me. Barely more than a smear, but enough to send my heart pounding against my ribs like a trapped thing. I sat still, afraid to move, afraid that moving might tip the balance of everything I was barely holding together. My hand trembled as I touched my belly. The silence roared back louder than ever, and I waited, breath shallow, for the only sound that mattered now, the quiet rhythmic flutter of a life I could not lose. The sun was still climbing when he rode in, just a silhouette on the horizon at first, dust curling around the hooves like the desert was trying to keep him. His horse was black as spilled oil, eyes burning like coals, ribs lean but powerful. The man on its back wore a coat the color of bone-dry earth, and he didn't bounce in the saddle like most cowboys. He moved like part of the beast, like something forged from fire and miles. Carson Hollow watched him arrive the way prairie dogs watch a hawk. Nobody said a word, but every man reached for the nearest bottle, and every woman pulled her child indoors. He didn't slow for the stares, didn't tip his hat or acknowledge the whispers. He rode straight through the town's spine, past the general store, past the livery, past the postmaster's porch, where the old men always sat and spat tobacco. Today, their mouths stayed shut. He dismounted in front of the saloon with a soundless ease that said he'd done it 1,000 times, most of those likely before drawing blood. His rifle hung over his shoulder, dull metal patched with fingerprints and history. But it was his face that caught the air, carved hard and sun-baked, like a cliff that had survived storms. A jagged scar ran down from his right ear to the curve of his jaw, pink and angry, like something that hadn't quite finished healing, or something that never would. Clint Maddox. That's what he called himself. He pushed through the batwing doors, and the room quieted like it knew the temperature had dropped. The piano player froze, fingers hovering above the keys. A card game stopped mid-bet. Someone coughed but tried to swallow it halfway through. Clint didn't bother looking around. He walked to the bar, sat down slow, and said, without a trace of hurry, "Black coffee." The bartender nodded like his life depended on it, and maybe it did. The pot hissed, steaming. Clint took a sip. Then, just loud enough for everyone to hear, he asked the question that ripped the air wide open. "Where's the girl they threw away?" No one answered right away, but every face in that room turned toward him, then toward the door, like they were waiting to see if God himself had walked in behind him. And for the first time in weeks, Carson Hollow didn't feel like the town with all the answers. It felt like a town waiting to be judged. The first thing I saw was the boots, dust-caked, sun-creased, the kind that had walked farther than most men had lived. Then the coat, hanging like a second skin over his broad frame, frayed at the cuffs but defiant against the wind. Clint Maddox stood in front of that sagging church door like he owned the land it was nailed to. He didn't knock. He didn't lower his voice. He just stood tall in that dead yard where weeds had grown taller than prayer and said it like gospel. "I'm here for my wife." It wasn't a question. It wasn't even a lie. It was a declaration, heavy and deliberate, like the sound of a gavel falling in a room that had never known justice. From behind him, boots crunched. The sheriff, Lyle Granger, all bluster and badge with nothing behind it, stepped forward, hand twitching near his holster, mouth twisted like he'd just bitten into something sour. "Your what?" Clint didn't even blink. "My wife," he said again. "And our baby. So unless this town's in the business of stealing families, I suggest you step aside." My breath caught in my throat. Every muscle in me turned to stone, like if I moved the moment might collapse in on itself. I stood in the doorway, one hand braced against the frame, the other curled instinctively around the swell of my stomach. I felt seen, and I hated how much I wanted to believe it. The sheriff didn't move, not forward, not back, just stood there, squinting, like he was trying to find the lie in Clint's eyes but kept getting lost in the truth. "Why?" I asked, finally. The word barely made it past my lips. "Why are you doing this?" Clint turned to me, and for the first time I saw his eyes, clear, sharp, and carved with something deeper than pity. "Because no one," he said, his voice steady as a promise, "should be judged by someone else's cowardice." The silence that followed was deafening, not the hush of fear, but of reckoning. The kind that crawled up the walls of the chapel and settled in the bones of the town like a warning. He reached for my hand. Didn't grab, didn't force, just offered it, like he knew what it meant to let a broken thing decide if it still wanted to be held. And I, a woman discarded like refuse, felt for the first time not rescued, but chosen. The whole town spilled into the street like cattle smelling blood. Doors slammed open. Boots thudded against dirt, and voices rose in a wild tangle of fear and fury. You could feel the tension in the air, thick, coppery, and close, like the moment right before a gun goes off. And there, in the middle of it all, stood Joseph Tucker. His face flushed the color of raw meat, spit flying from his mouth as he roared, "She's a whore. She played us. Lied to me, lied to God. Lied to all of you." He stood like he was owed something, like his humiliation gave him the right to howl and shake, hands twitching at his sides, craving a fight he wasn't man enough to win. And the townsfolk, they leaned in, feeding off it, feeding him. Because Joseph, for all his cowardice, had one thing they loved, a common enemy, and that enemy was me. Clint didn't move at first. He just stared, calm as the eye of a storm, one hand resting lightly on his hip, close enough to his revolver that every man watching suddenly remembered they had something to lose. Then he said it. "She's mine now." Just those 3 words. No yelling, no chest beating, just a calm, lethal kind of truth that landed like a stone in a still pond. "And if you got a problem with that," he added, tilting his head ever so slightly, "I got 6 bullets and none of them like liars." The crowd stilled. The noise collapsed into the kind of silence that feels like it's holding its breath. The preacher's boy dropped the broom he'd been holding. A dog whimpered and slunk under the boardwalk. The sheriff, Sheriff Lyle, all 10-gallon hat and 10-cent spine, put 1 foot forward, then stopped dead when Clint's eyes met his. It wasn't just defiance in Clint's face. It was history. Experience. The kind of violence that doesn't bark. It waits. Cold, patient, and guaranteed. And just like that, the balance shifted. No one looked at me like trash anymore. They looked like they'd seen a ghost. And maybe they had. Maybe they saw the ghost of every cruel thing they'd ever said, every righteous insult, every self-serving whisper they'd spread about me behind their clean, church-going hands. Because now someone stood beside me, and for the first time I wasn't just the girl with the belly and the baggage. I was the woman with the gunman. The church felt different after nightfall, less like a ruin, more like a secret. Moonlight spilled through the broken window pane in fractured beams, pooling across the warped floorboards and catching on the floating dust-like stars trying to find their way home. I sat where the pews used to be, wrapped in Clint's old coat, listening to the soft hiss of wind slipping through the cracks in the walls. He leaned against the doorway, arms crossed, hat low over his brow, like he'd been standing guard over something worth dying for. He didn't speak for a long time, just stared out into the dark, jaw tight, the scar on his face catching the light and turning raw again. Then, without turning, he said, "I knew Joseph Tucker long before you did." The words didn't shock me. Not really. There was something in the way Clint had looked at him back in town, like a man who'd already seen the end of a story and hated how it finished. He used to write letters to women, lonely ones, desperate ones. He'd promised them land, marriage, a name. Got real good at it, real smooth with the ink. He paused. The silence that followed felt too full to breathe in. One of them was my sister, Clara. The name hit the air like a dropped lantern, soft at first, then suddenly heavy with flame. "She believed him," he said. "Saved every letter like scripture. She left home with a ribbon in her hair and a Bible under her arm. When she got to him, he said she wasn't what he expected. Said she wasn't clean. Threw her out like garbage." Clint's voice didn't crack. That made it worse. She made it 2 towns over before she swallowed a bottle of lye. The silence afterward wasn't holy. It was violent, like the whole world had pulled back just enough to let grief breathe. I didn't know what to say. What do you say to a man who's been carrying a ghost for years? Clint finally turned to face me. His eyes, always steel-hard and unreadable, softened just a breath. "I came here to kill him," he said. "But then I saw you, and something in me stopped." He knelt slowly so we were eye to eye. "You were supposed to be justice," he said. "But now, you're something more." And in that moment, I realized what had changed. I wasn't just the end of his story. I was the beginning of mine. They held the trial in the schoolhouse, cleared out the desks, propped up a splintering podium for the judge, and lined the windows with men who thought justice was a thing you could bend if you stared hard enough. But Clint made sure that wouldn't happen. He rode out 2 days before and came back with Judge Merton Graves from over in Dry Creek, a man with a spine and a record for hanging more liars than he let walk. That rattled the town some. So did the fact that Clint made Joseph sit there, front and center, cuffed like a common thief. Joseph tried to play it clean at first, wore his Sunday best, trimmed his beard, smiled that same serpent smile he must have worn when he first wrote Clara. He claimed I was a grifter, a wanderer with no name and a fake story. Said I came to Carson Hollow to trap a good man into raising another man's bastard. Claimed he'd seen my type before. Said I was nothing new. But Clint didn't flinch. He didn't argue. He unfolded the truth. Letter by letter. Clara's letters. Mine. 3 others. All women who'd answered Joseph's promises only to be cast aside when they arrived. He brought one of them in. Martha Langdon. A quiet woman with a child too young to lie and eyes too tired to pretend. She stood behind that podium, hands shaking, and told the room how Joseph Tucker met her off the train, smiled, took her to his ranch, then locked her out the next morning with nothing but a coin and a curse. The room got real quiet after that. The sheriff tried to speak, but Clint silenced him with a stare that said, "You're part of this too." And for once, Lyle Granger stayed seated. When the judge read the charges, fraud, seduction, attempted assault, he didn't even look up at Joseph, just asked the jury if they'd reached a verdict. 12 hands rose. 12 guilties followed. Joseph didn't shout, didn't beg. He just stared at the floor, like the ground had turned against him too. They stripped him of his land, his name, his pride. No jail, but exile. He was to leave town by sunset and never return. A man with nothing is the cruelest kind of ghost. And I sat in the front row, hands resting gentle on the curve of my belly, spine straight, head high. I felt the weight lift. Not all of it, but enough. Enough to breathe like a free woman. Enough to finally belong to no one. Except myself. After the trial, the dust didn't settle so much as it learned to move around us. Clint stayed, not out of duty or debt, but something quieter, something that hummed beneath the surface, steady as a heartbeat. He didn't ask if he could, just rolled up his sleeves the next morning and started fixing the back wall of the church like he'd always meant to live there, like he saw something worth building again. He patched the roof with salvaged tin, turned a ruined pew into a cradle, and tilled the rocky patch of land behind the chapel into rows straight enough to hold hope. The first seeds we planted weren't just corn. They were proof that something could grow here that wasn't shame. He didn't talk much, not unless it mattered. But when he did, his words landed like anchors, solid, unshakable, never too heavy to carry. He'd say things like, "Weather's turning, better move the basin closer," or, "That kickboard's loose, don't want you tripping in the dark." And once, when I was bent over a wash basin, the weight of everything pressing down on my back, he passed me a folded cloth and said, "You ain't broken, just rebuilding. That takes time." He built a cradle before I asked him to, painted the nursery blue without asking what I wanted, laid new floorboards in the chapel where I'd bled and prayed and bled again. One morning, just after the frost lifted and the earth stopped groaning under the weight of winter, I found him kneeling by the garden bed, his hand deep in the soil, the other holding a small, velvet-wrapped box. "I never planned for this," he said, not looking up yet. "Hell, I didn't even believe a man like me got second chances." Then he looked at me, really looked, like I wasn't just the woman he'd stood beside in court, but the woman who had taught him how to stay. "But I think you and me, and that little one, we were meant to rebuild." The gold band inside that box was simple, no diamonds, no inscription, just a circle, smooth and strong, forged for hands that knew how to hold without hurting. I said yes, not out of need, not because I was tired or grateful or afraid, but because he never once treated me like I needed to be saved, only seen, only worthy. Carson Hollow didn't apologize, not outright. Towns like this don't speak their sins aloud. They let them hang in the air, half swallowed by dust and Sunday hymns. But they changed, subtly, slowly, like a wound learning to scar. The stares didn't vanish, but they shifted. No longer sharp enough to cut, more like the cautious glances a man gives a rattlesnake sunbathing on his porch, respect born from fear, or maybe shame. They still whispered, sure, but now the whispers didn't circle me alone. They wrapped around him, around us. Clint Maddox, the stranger who'd ridden in with dust on his boots and fire in his eyes, had become something else entirely. Something bigger than a man. A myth in the making. Kids mimicked his walk when they thought no one was looking. Ranch hands drank quieter when he passed. Even Sheriff Granger started tipping his hat lower, as if the brim might shield him from remembering how little he'd done when it counted. And me? I walked through Carson Hollow not as a fallen woman, but as something harder to reckon with. A mother, a wife, a survivor. I didn't shrink anymore when I passed the general store. I didn't flinch when Miss Lorna and her clutch of bonneted gossips turned their eyes toward my belly. I walked straight-backed and steady, with Clint's arm around my waist and my name etched into the town ledger as Mrs. Wade Maddox. The day our child came was blue-skied and breathless. Labor gripped me like the devil himself, but I never let it take me under. Clint held my hand, jaw tight, whispering prayers he didn't believe in, just in case they worked. And when the cry rang out, raw and perfect, I knew the world had been cracked open and stitched back together in that one holy sound. We named him Justice, not because it was poetic, but because it was true. Justice hadn't come in a courtroom, not in a sermon, not from the hands of the men who once tried to erase me. It came on horseback, with a rifle slung over one shoulder, past full of pain, and a heart willing to stay. It came when someone looked at me and didn't see a mistake, but a future worth fighting for.